It's great to welcome back to the program Michael Wood Jr., who's a police management expert, activist, president of Veterans Stand, as well as former Baltimore police commander. Michael, it's great to have you back on the program, and the timing really couldn't be better, although I don't know if better is the right word to use here. You reacted to this speech that Donald Trump gave in front of a law enforcement crowd, where he sort of jokingly said, it's really not a bad idea to kind of rough up suspects that you have in custody if they've been accused or are suspected of having committed a serious enough crime, which to me, it was disturbing on so many levels, not the least of which that being arrested for something is not the same as having been convicted of something, regardless of how serious it is. So take it from the top. I mean, what was your reaction to the comments from President Trump?
Well, thanks for having me again. And I mean, the basic idea that's really bothering me when it comes to what Trump is saying is that that's the seed that we kind of have in our culture, that we aren't looking at the command structure, we aren't looking at the actual power that's incentivizing all this and setting these balls in motion. What we end up doing is we blame the officer that actually bangs the head on the door.
Mm.
But this whole thing is a part of a culture that comes down. And when you are the president, then you are talking down to police officers or whoever's out on the street to execute your will to go and do something that is against the basic premise of professional law enforcement. Even as bad as American law enforcement is, there is not a best practices book or a police expert out there that's going to say you treat convicted suspects this way, let alone citizens who are proven innocent, who are innocent until proven guilty. So there is this systemic attitude where policing ends up encapsulating like what America really is. And I'm anti-Trump just as much as I'm anti-sneezing, but I don't blame the sneeze for my sneeze. Like he is a product of us. And if we can't see that this really demonstrates what America is in its soul, and we need to fight that, then I don't really know what people are looking at.
There's a similar idea that we sometimes hear when it comes to the sentencing of individuals convicted of child sex abuse and some other crimes sometimes. This idea that, hey, their punishment will be made worse because they might get sexually assaulted in our prisons or in our jails. And when I hear that, I say, that's not something that we should be applauding because it's going to make their time worse. That's sort of an inability of our prison system to keep individuals safe. Like the fact that you might be sexually assaulted in prison, depending on the crime that you're convicted of, that's something that we should be concerned about, not cheering as part of some additional justice. Is there a similarity between these two ideas?
We should be incredibly concerned. And I'm really happy you brought that up and have made that connection that you see in our prison system. And again, that is America, right? We say to ourselves, let's punish this person. Let's put them into a system where they will have injustice, inhumanity. They will be assaulted and have all this punishment go down upon them, despite the fact that punishment isn't going to do anything to make the situation better. And then we are trying to like change the prison system and say criminal justice needs to be better, but at the same time applauding when someone we don't like goes into an inhumane system. We do the same thing with police. Like as much as I want to see accountability in policing, there is no justice in sending a police officer to an inhumane and unjust system. So we have to really look in ourselves to figure out like what do we really want policing to be? Are we the country that's going to stand up and say we want to be a punitive thing? We don't care about science, despite the fact that every meta-analysis of scientific literature will show you that punishment does not equal a deterrent, that we are still so hell-bent on being a violent society that wants to even thinks that these things would work. Like we're going down a pathway that is incredibly concerning to me. And obviously it is to you.
You used the word systemic a little bit earlier in the interview. And I think if we sort of imagine a spectrum, you might have those completely on one side who believe that the issues with police violence and police brutality are 100% systemic and that there's very little blame to place on the individual officers. On the other side of that spectrum, you might imagine those who believe this is merely a few bad apples. Only the individual police officers are to blame here, and there is nothing systemic going on. The truth is probably sort of somewhere in the middle of that, but I want to ask you, where do you think it is? In other words, how much of this problem is the individuals? How much of the problem is systemic?
I mean, like, of course, I'm throwing out a bullshit park number, but I'm going to go with probably 95% to 99% is completely systemic.
Hmm.
The way I can kind of encapsulate this on an individual, intimate level here is that I grew up trying to be race blind. I mean, I grew up in the age of information in mixed neighborhoods, and I had this idea to myself that as a police officer, what I was going to do is be impartial. I was going to follow the letter of the law. I was going to follow departmental policies to a T. And it took me a while, but I realized eventually at the end that all of my actions of what I was empirically doing on the street was racist. It was prejudice against the society. It was inhumane. It was unjust. And all of those things that I was doing, I was really looking at the system and saying, if we do this perfectly, if we do this system perfectly, then we will have justice. So
So
I
explain
fought
that a little bit.
super
Like, so,
hard to
so
do
for
that.
example, I mean, having interviewed you before, would one example of what you're talking about be, despite the reality that you went in wanting to be race blind and not discriminating, et cetera, for example, by virtue of the neighborhoods you were policing, the impact of your policing was going to be effectively racist? Is that an example of what you mean?
Yeah, that's a good example. Or whether I put someone into bond, or whether I was looking at, so I thought I was a narcotics detective hunting down narcotics, but I wasn't. There was an entire half of that city, which we know empirically without a doubt, and anyone can argue it, and I know it from practical experience, that white communities have just as much drugs, if not more. One
Hmm.
reason why cocaine sentencing is much higher is not because of a racist thing intentionally, it's because cocaine is a white drug. And so white drugs end up having more resources. So a mid-level dealer ends up being much higher on the scale of being resource, same damn word I used a second ago. But so those things that when we end up doing, we think this is normal, but when we end up going after the drug, where do they put me? They put me in East and West Baltimore to go after drug dealers. So I end up going after only the community because the drug dealing and drug possession is actually equal, if not more, in a rich and white community. Think about it. Drugs are expensive. Like they're not going to, I mean, people with money have more drugs than people without money.
Hmm.
That's just it's even rational. But where was I sent to go get the drugs? In redlined, poor neighborhoods to put into an inhumane system that has a bail system that they can't do. So it's not necessarily the officer's fault that when they're doing that, and even if they do it well, they send people into a system. So even if you had a police department that was operating perfectly, they would still be sending people and handing them off to a state's attorney who the state's attorneys are blatantly corrupt around the country. They are incentivized in that same system. So they have the same problems. They're incentivized to win, not for justice. So, like, we talk about federal prosecutors, like, oh, you better be aware of those federal prosecutors. They have a 97% conviction rate. Well, they don't have a 97% conviction rate. They have a 97% victory rate, which means the cases are plead down or whatever they do, they use and manipulate power so that they can rise to the ranks. So they don't get incentivized to do the right thing. They get incentivized for the most convictions to rise up through the ranks. And then prisons are incentivized to be as efficient as possible. So give people as really little resources as possible while we're doing this punishment system. So it is this whole big institution that police officers are a pawn of. It's the people above the street cops that all set this thing into motion and don't take any of the responsibility for it. One reason why you see cops getting away with committing murders right on camera is when these things indict the system. When they indict the system, the whole thing will rally around them to protect them and get them off, like Freddie Gray.
Hmm.
So when the officers killed Freddie Gray in Baltimore, no supervisors took accountability for this. So understanding this killing, what happened is by the court case anyway, he goes into a van where they're supposed to be transporting him to a prison cell. They already put him in there for really sketchy reasons to begin with. But then they bring him out of the van dead. So the whole time, this is a van that doesn't have seatbelts, doesn't have proper supervision, doesn't have cameras in the back, doesn't have any accountability. And Freddie Gray was the fourth person to be killed or paralyzed in the back of those vans just in recent history. But no command members, Kevin Davis doesn't pay a price, the mayor doesn't pay a price. Nobody has anything happen to them other than the individual officer at the bottom who was really just a pawn all along.
We've been speaking with Michael Wood Jr. He is a former Baltimore police commander. You can follow him on Twitter at Michael A. Wood Jr. and also check out civilianledpolicing.org. Michael, always great to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. Thanks for throwing in those pictures there. We definitely need people to go to Veteran Stand and civilian-led policing. That is the way you guys can take something in your own hands and do something in your community.